So hi everyone, I'm Beatrice Gallelli, China Fellow at the Istituto Affari Internazionali, IAI, working in the Global Actor Program, and I'm also an assistant professor at Ca' Foscari University in Venice. Today I'm extremely happy and glad to have with me Marina Rudyak. Marina is a sinologist working at the intersection between China studies and development studies. Her research focuses on China as a global development actor, especially China foreign aid and development lending policy, the implication of the Belt and Road Initiative, and China in Central Asia and Africa. She's also interested in political ideology of the Chinese Communist Party and the coded communication in Chinese politics. This with Marina is the second of four discussions with the leading experts in the field of China's history, China's political communication, China's public diplomacy. So in the interview is part of a one-year project called Countering Chinese Disinformation in Italy. We started before the last time we had an interview with Alexandra Berzina-Cherenkova, talking about China relations with Russia, especially against the backdrop of the still ongoing, unfortunately, war to Ukraine. Today, we will focus on another crucial issue, that is the Belt and Road Initiative. We all know that the Belt and Road Initiative sparked quite a heated debate when it was launched in 2013 by the still current president, Xi Jinping, of the People's Republic of China. And the Belt and Road Initiative in Italy was a topic of a two-year project carried out by IAI. The project was aimed at analyzing the risks carried by the official joining by the Italian government at the time of the Belt and Road Initiative through the Memorandum of Understanding signed in 2019. But today with Marina, we try to analyze what has changed over the years and trying to understand whether there are any changes, and especially the implication of the Belt and Road Initiative for China-EU and China-Global South relations. So I'd like to start with the first question, which is also another contradiction. Last time with Una, we talked about many contradictions in Chinese politics and China's political communication, and we will start with another one. So when Xi Jinping first announced the Belt and Road Initiative, it was understood abroad as a manifestation, as a sign of a more proactive approach by Chinese leader to China's foreign policy. So it was at in the meanwhile, while promoting the Belt and Road Initiative, there was also Chinese leaders launched other concepts such as the new type of great power relations, for instance. At the same time, the Belt and Road Initiative has not brought any changes in the status of development countries in China. So the first question that I would like to ask Marina, is whether the Belt and Road Initiative is a sign of any radical transformation of China's foreign policy, or it's just another kind of more subtle difference with compared to the previous administration. That's my first question. Thank you, Marina, for being with us today.
Thank you, Beatrice, for the wonderful introduction and for the question. As you just highlighted, it sounds like a contradiction to want to be a developing country and a great power, but it is only a contradiction looking from the European perspective. It is not a contradiction for China. if we look at how China describes its status, it is described by exactly these 2 points, that China is a developing country, is still a developing country, and is going to be a developing country for a long time, and that China is a big power, a 大国, or a strong power, a 强国. And this is not a contradiction from the Chinese perspective. So the change that we are seeing applies to the house of the foreign policy. It does not apply to the what of China is. What I mean by that is that since Deng Xiaoping, and I'm sure Una talked about that, the foreign policy orientation, the foreign policy doctrine was to hide your talents and bide your time, which, by the way, is not an invention by Deng Xiaoping, but it's actually a quote by one of the Chinese classics, namely the story of King Guojian, whose empire was captured by the neighboring empire of Wu. King Guojian was put into prison, was made to serve as a slave to the king of Wu, and he served so nicely and so bravely that the king made him his confidant and in the end bestowed him with his old empire. What King Guojian did is to sit silently, hide out, build up his army, bide his time, and when he reached strength, to go to war against Wu and then to conquer Wu. Now, I'm not saying that China is going to a war with the West, but the metaphor is one that you bide your time till you are strong, and then you stop doing that. And this is what we saw with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping in the end decided that now China is strong enough to shine. And this was the shift to his foreign policy of, which has been translated in the West as being proactive. But if you look at the Chinese wording, it's about, being shiny and brilliant and glorious. So his point is now that China is strong enough to be one of the big powers in the center of the world. And this is where he sees his role. Mao was the one who united China and shook off the colonial powers and ended the civil war. Xi will be the one who leads the China back to the center of the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And then it is extremely interesting, and perhaps we will go deeper into the concept of developing country, for how long China will be a developing country, because it is a key issue I'm interested in the first stage of socialism, which is the idea of China that has not reached the kind of the level of development to move to the second stage of socialism. So perhaps this will be the topic of another interview. But let's keep talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, and so that also the narratives on the Belt and Road Initiative. And the narratives were not merely promoted by the Chinese leaders' narrative, but also abroad. One of the key issue and concern for on the Belt and Road Initiative was the debt trap. So the idea was that basically China may deliberately provide loans that are impossible to pay back by debtor nations, so that Chinese companies would eventually take control of the co-financed infrastructure. This was the main idea behind the narrative of the debt trap. And of course, the most obvious example of the application of the debt trap was the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, so a country in the so-called global south. And the idea was that indeed China's Belt and Road Initiative was extremely dangerous for the global south. So my question is, of of course, we cannot generalize. All the countries in the global south are not the same. But I'd like to ask you whether you think that Beijing is a development partner or a new colonizer in this very, very much polarized debate.
It is certainly clear that China wants to be a development partner. It carries a very specific anti-colonial rhetoric. Whenever we see Chinese leaders talking to African countries, they refer to the joint anti-imperial and anti-colonial struggle China fought along them in the 20th century. And I think we have to take this rhetoric seriously and the internationalist motives that have dominated the Chinese discourse on development, which has been in essence, to quote a speech by Zhou Enlai, by China's prime minister under Mao, which I think still stands. Zhou Enlai said in 1956, just 1 year after he traveled to the Bandung conference in Indonesia, that China has understood that economic independence is the only way to ensure political independence. And because of that, despite being poor, China is going to give aid to other countries to ensure that they are economically independent, so they can be politically independent from the West, obviously. And I think this motive, in essence, still carries, and it still carries with the Belt and Road Initiative. So it is, by itself an anti-colonial motive, but if you look at the implementation and with just how much economic statecraft China is going into the countries where it's aiding, where it's investing, you see that it does create a substantial asymmetry if the partner country does not have a bureaucratic structure and experience and power to manage incoming Chinese aid and development finance. So how good, countries can manage China depends very much on their government. So I would not subscribe to the point of colonialism. Mm-hmm. I say China wants to be a developing partner, but still, because of the inexperience of China in development management abroad, not at home, abroad, because China is trying to export its own development model, which worked in China but may not work the same way in other countries. If that meets governments who are, greedy for loans because they've promised their constituencies new roads and new ports, and who are not very experienced in managing projects, it creates a debt trap, but a debt trap for both sides. Because for China, it's also a problem when a country cannot pay back. But where the scholarship unanimously agrees is that there is no strategy for debt trap diplomacy. And the Hambantota case you mentioned doesn't really work as proof for that. Why? Because when China leased out the Hambantota, when Sri Lanka leased out the Hambantota port to China, it was not default, and it didn't lease it out because it could not pay Chinese loans. It leased it out because the repayment for Eurobonds, for loans Sri Lanka had taken from private creditors on international markets, were upcoming for repayment. They were more expensive than the Chinese loans. There was a leadership change in Sri Lanka, and the new president saw an opportunity to get rid of an unprofitable port built by his predecessor, by the way, in his home province, and leased it out to China to use the revenue to repay Eurobonds. The problem is that it didn't solve Sri Lanka's problem. It just delayed the default by a few years. The same pattern, by the way, we see, so not the same pattern, but if we look at the composition of the creditors, China was not the biggest creditor of Sri Lanka, not even the biggest bilateral one at that point. The biggest creditors of Sri Lanka were private banks. And the same pattern we see in Africa, where we talk about, China being the biggest African problem, but actually African countries own 3 times as much to European private banks than to China. So the problem is that the problem is not just China.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Because this one is one of the most tricky issues in the debate on the Belt and Road Initiative. Now it seems to me that also due to this kind of argument, so the kind of debt trap argument and all the other criticism towards the Belt and Road Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative in itself has been somehow sidelined by Chinese leaders, at least in the official discourse addressing a foreign audience, and also to a lesser extent, perhaps in the domestic politics as well. So, for instance, at the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party held in Beijing recently, the Belt and Road Initiative was no longer included in the political report in the section dealing with China's foreign policy. In that section of the political report, other concepts were included, such as the Global Security Initiative or the Global Development Initiative. And if you agree with me, if you also perceive that the Belt and Road Initiative is somehow sidelined, has been somehow sidelined in the discourse at least, why you think it is the case?
The point you're making has been discussed a lot, and what we hear from China on that, when Chinese stakeholders are being asked, is that the Belt and Road is still there and around, and of course it has to be, because it has been incorporated into the party constitution and it's very much linked to Xi Jinping, but that it kind of received an upgrade with the Global Development Initiative. And has been incorporated into the Global Development Initiative. So the Belt and Road Initiative was a Chinese initiative to link countries to China in a way. And now the Global Development Initiative, at least this is how it's presented by Xi Jinping, is put on the table as a global public good provided by China to present Chinese development solutions and China's wisdom and experience to the world, to share China's development experience. So the Belt and Road is not gone. It has been just put under a new and bigger umbrella.
Okay, but may I ask you, given that the Global Development Initiative is more linked to China's approach to development and China's solution to development, now I have 2 questions. The first one: is there any changes in the target? Do you feel that the Belt and Road Initiative was targeted also to, in addition to the countries in the global south, also to Europe, for instance, while the Global Development Initiative is more for so-called, which is a very bad name, but so-called developing countries? And do you think that the Global Development Initiative is based on a new paradigm? So a kind of development which may also help us to overcome the shortcomings of our model of development in terms of environmental pollution and social inequality.
I think the main direction of how China understands development has not changed. It's rather than on the way China is figuring out how to manage development abroad and is trying different strategies of how to communicate itself to the outside world. When I say the strategy, the idea and the notions of development have not changed. What I mean by that is that basically since the early 20th century, since China stepped on the development, on modernization path with the founding of the modern China, development was understood primarily as technology and industry-centered development. Mm-hmm. And this is something that has not changed. And this is different to the understanding of development in the Euro-American space, which also includes political dimensions, namely political liberalization, human rights, good governance. And what we have seen both with the Belt and Road Initiative and with the Global Development Initiative is China trying to promote its vision of development, that first development is one that is technology-centered, industry-centered, because this will then create social progress. Development, first of all, needs stability. How the Chinese government understands stability is the absence of political dissent. This is why the Global Development Initiative is linked to the Global Security Initiative. And finally, development is a right. And this is something China has repeatedly put on the table in the human rights debate, arguing that there is not a universality of human rights, but rather a hierarchy of human rights, with the right to development being the highest one. And the right to development is, again, the right to technological and industrial and so on modernization. And also resolving, climate change issues with technology. Now, with the Global Development Initiative, in a way, China is trying to do two things. One thing is to mainstream, or at least to normalize its vision of development as one concept that exists legitimately parallel to other concepts, which liberal democracies have considered to be universal, and to put the topic of development back on the table. Now, on the first point, we probably disagree, what development is and how it's supposed to happen. But the second point, namely bringing development back on the table, bringing development back into the debate, is a legitimate and right topic. The question is, does China have the right solutions, or are the right solutions somewhere else? But that we should be talking about development is absolutely correct and essential.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marina. It was a great discussion on a very controversial topic, the Belt and Road Initiative and the Global Development Initiative. And you also touched upon other very controversial issues, such as the human rights, China's understanding of human rights, and the way they somehow trying to include development within them and place the most important part of development, which is defined as the most important human rights. So thank you very much. This interview will be available on the website of IAI, and it will also be translated into Italian for the Italian speakers world. Thank you again, Marina. It was extremely great, a great discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you.